So you think there's a world where human beings lose their altruistic side?
It's a possibility. As I said, I'm a critical optimist. I think that we will be able to prevent that from being realized. But there is absolutely a logical possibility that can happen. There is a possible world out there in which human beings lose their capacity for effective praxis, that they become immersed in a type of hyper-individualized, selfish, almost cruel behavior where they relish the suffering of others as opposed to find that horrifying.
Very true. But sometimes I do think we focus on the negative. I mean, even in this hyper-capitalized or atomized world, rather, you still see extraordinary levels of magnanimity and kindness and love. And, you know, people go on the streets to protest for causes which are so far away from their regular lives. I mean, and we see this all the time. But for me, this is this fundamental part of being human, and this can never be eradicated, regardless of what economic system we have. This will always be a part of us. As you said, we have great capacity to be good and great capacity to also be evil. And that is human nature. And just trying to, you know, balance this. It's this constant fight between the two.
As you said, the key thing about protest is, I cannot agree with you more on this point, is because the brilliant political theorist Hannah Arendt has this wonderful expression where she talks about power, but she talks about power not as this ability to get people to do things, where that can be a form of repression or violence, but power as a kind of creative or productive activity, which comes into form when there are people. It's like where there's people, there's power. And it's a sense of, I think, if you have public, you know, the fact that we have public space, it's a kind of key feature of urban environments, despite all of the, you know, sometimes slightly terrifyingly claustrophobic experience of being in an urban context. You have public spaces where people can go on protests. That's the kind of lifeblood of keeping human beings proactive and caring, because it points to use an expression from another philosopher that I have huge admiration for, Axel Honneth. Honneth uses this notion of this untapped normative surplus. So it's like when you see, for example, struggles for recognition. So you see queer pride, you see Black Lives Matter protests. It gives you a sense of life affirmation, because you see that, for example, despite all of the attempts to negate these life worlds, to render the lives of folk of color, of trans folk and the like, unlivable under particularly oppressive regimes, the ability to come together with allies is a celebratory aspect of humanity, which is a source of joy. And I think that's something which doesn't get talked about enough. Is that, you know, particularly at institutions like SOAS, where all of the talk about, you know, the post-colonial and decolonial is always about the oppression of capitalism, the oppression of racism. So sure, you know, no one is denying that these are kind of quite horrible environments, but it would be a hugely, ironically, with terms of racial and ethnic discourse here, hugely culturally imperialistic and racist to say that folk of color can't experience joy, or that trans folk can't experience joy, or that queer folk can't experience joy, or gender non-binary folk can't experience joy. Part of actually what is the most interesting thing about reflecting on communities that experience oppression is their capacity for joy. And Desmond Tutu makes this point very explicitly in his work on Ubuntu, where he says, it's despite all attempts to dehumanize you, you still retain your humanity, and others acknowledge that. And I think that's as you said, that's the kind of thing that we are always kind of working through. We can do so many things to rehumanize each other: art, music, dancing, etc. Jokes, laughter. There's nothing quite like laughter as well. But also we can do terrible things. But I think by and large, the more you have people together, the more naturally productive power relations come from that in the Hannah Arendt sense. And you see these kinds of notions of care come to the fore.